Top story this evening, the pace of transformation in the financial sector must increase. This is according to the Standing Committee on Finance and Portfolio Committee on Trade and Industry, which have finalized the first report on financial sector transformation. The report follows extensive public hearings held in March and May. An interim report was finalized on the 6th of September and sent to participants for comment. Many of their responses were included in the final report. The National Assembly is to vote on the report on the 28th of November. The report's key recommendations for the financial sector are as follows: to compel industry to provide necessary information to the Financial Sector Chartered Council and a broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Commission, make achieving targets a precondition for licensing of financial institutions. DTI and B-BBEE Commission to develop system of effective fines for failure to achieve targets. Government to reduce high levels of monopoly in banking subsector to encourage new entrants. Treasury to consider ways of increasing black ownership in major banks and must furnish regular reports. Legislative changes to allow for proportional entry requirements for new entrants. The Reserve Bank needs to do far more to encourage competition in the financial sector. Support for easing of license and other requirements for new entrants in the financial sector, and strong action against the bank collusion on manipulation of currency trading. Consider tightening legislation to reduce prospects of bank collusion, and lastly, banks and law enforcement institutions to do more to combat illicit financial flows. Certified Financial Planner at Financial Planning Institute SA, Sydney Sikese, is joining us over the phone line. Very good evening to you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. What is your first reaction to the Standing Committee on Finance and the Portfolio Committee on Trade and Industry's recommendations that the pace of transformation in SA financial sector is slow?
For sure. Thanks a lot for the opportunity, Stephanie. I think we've come a long way in terms of improving the outlook or the position of transformation. But I think the committee's observation is that, transformation is quite broad-based. So, for an example, there are voluntary initiatives that have come through, and I believe this kind of, initiative needs to be regulated. I think it's a step in the right direction to galvanize this kind of move. So players in the market have really done a lot of initiatives that they've been on a voluntary basis.
And also the committee has recommended that industry must be compelled to abide by the Financial Sector Code. Why is that not happening as of now?
Sure. Going back to my earlier comment, historically it hasn't been stringent, and all the stakeholders performed according to very less stringent guidelines. So I think if things are legislated, it will go a long way. And again, there needs to be a further definition of transformation. As it stands right now, it seems to be more on quotas and other, in terms of demographics. But I believe there are other aspects that can improve that transformation agenda.
And then market concentration, monopolization and ownership, especially in the banking sector, has come under flack in this report. How easy is it, do you think, to dismantle the monopolies in the banking sector in particular?
Yeah, sure. It's going to be a very challenging exercise to unbundle. But, now that things have escalated to this level, I think a forced change will make the profile much better. It will be a very challenging journey ahead. It won't be easy.
And also the recommendation says that there should be fines on those organizations that are not complying with transformation. What is your reaction on that?
Yeah, so I think if they implement fines, I think it's a step in the right direction, as it will ensure that they keep pace on their targets, and you know, I think it will provide a great level of change.
Thank you so much for joining us on the phone line. Certified Financial Planner at the Financial Planning Institute for South Africa, Sydney Sekese, joining us on the phone line, giving us some advice and inputs on what will happen with the reaction on the Standing Committee on Finance and Portfolio Committee. Well, President Jacob Zuma has directed Minister of Finance Malusi Gigaba to urgently address the challenges identified in the medium-term budget policy statement. The President, as well as Cabinet, have reaffirmed government's commitment to maintain a sustainable fiscal framework. This is to ensure a solution is found to address the roughly 40 billion rand revenue shortfall. This would be achieved through a combination of expenditure reductions and revenue-enhancing measures. The budget structures would consider the resulting proposals in preparation for the 2018 budget. President Zuma would meet with the Presidential Fiscal Committee to receive a progress report.
President Jacob Zuma has directed the Minister of Finance, Mr. Malusi Gigaba, assisted by the Presidential Fiscal Committee, to identify concrete measures to urgently address the challenges identified in the medium-term budget policy statement. The President will in the coming days meet with the Presidential Fiscal Committee to receive a progress report on the work done on the directives that he has given.
The Presidential Fiscal Committee would focus on 4 specific areas to identify and finalize proposals for cuts in expenditure amounting to about 25 billion rand. Proposals for revenue-enhancing measures of about 15 billion rand, including where appropriate tax measures. To develop a phased implementation plan to enable the proposal for fee-free higher education for students from poor and working-class backgrounds. To identify a package of economic stimulus measures that would enable the economy to grow at a faster rate. And joining us live in studio is political analyst Tshepo Khadima. Thank you so much for joining us, sir, once again here on ANN7. It's always a pleasure having you here. Now, let's take a look at the current financial situation in South Africa. Do you think that Gigaba will be able to fill that 40 billion rand gap?
No, in fact, the gap is bigger than 40 billion rand on a number of fronts. We have to also maybe take into context when we started the beginning of the financial year. At the beginning of the financial year, the revenue target, which was to be collected by South African Revenue Service, was 1,265 billion rand. That is the target that had been set by the erstwhile Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan. Of course, we know that after he was removed, then the rating agencies downgraded our country. And when they downgraded our country, already at the time when the Minister of Finance read the budget deficit was 149 billion rand or 150 billion rand. And when you analyzed as to what was the key source of that budget deficit, simply meaning that what government was looking to collect and what government was looking to spend, there was a shortfall of 149 billion rand. And that 149 billion rand was actually going to be financed, or that budget deficit was going to be bridged through borrowings, meaning the state was going to be issuing bonds on the market, domestically and internationally, to raise that money. But that 149 billion rand was actually our interest costs on our debt, which at that time was 2.2 trillion rand. Immediately after we got downgraded by the rating agencies, that unfortunately increased our interest costs, which at the beginning of the year, they were 169 billion. So if there hadn't been the debt, South Africa would have been having a budget surplus of 20 billion rand if we were to meet the revenue collection target of 1,265 billion. So the country would have been in a budget deficit. But because of the debt that we have, we then ended up with the budget deficit of 149 billion. However, we were then our interest costs were 169 billion, and hence the figures that I'm giving. Immediately after we got downgraded and then revised the GDP growth downwards from 1.3% to 0.7%, hence the revenue shortfall of 50 billion rand that has been spoken much about in terms of the income or tax that will have been collected. That, unfortunately, the downgrading pushed our debt servicing costs from 169 billion rand to 239 billion. So as a direct result of the downgrade, we now ended up with a budget deficit today sitting at 240 billion, so to speak. However, last Friday, and as I had consistently predicted in all platforms, public platforms, that we were going to be downgraded, it is not surprising that we were downgraded and put on review. However, what that means is, and I am astonished that the Presidential Fiscal Commission actually have not yet even factored this in, because it means that as a direct result of Friday's downgrade to junk by Standard & Poor's and the review, that there are covenants that are on our debt, which means that the agreements between us as a country in terms of our borrowings and the lenders who are giving us that money, which is supposed to be 240 billion rand, the covenants that they are demanding. But as a direct result of the downgrade, it means we're now going to need more than 240 billion rand. So therefore, it is not 40 billion rand that is at stake here. It's actually 240 billion. But for the viewers at home, they might want to know this. If we just look at our tax collection, revised downwards by 50 billion rand, as has been the case, it means that South Africa on its income from taxes is paying 20 cents out of every rand that it collects in income, is paying that on interest on the debt that we have. This situation, this is calamitous, to say the least. And I don't know why people have not woken up to that, because 20 cents. Now, if you add the 240 billion that was planned to be raised from the so-called investors to then be able to meet our interest cost payments of 240 billion, it would mean that our debt servicing costs are at 16.5 cents. If you take the income from what we borrow and from the taxes, you combine it, 16.5 cents of every rand that is collected goes towards servicing the debt that we have. And even greater tragedy is awaiting us in 2018. Because in 2018, there's a series of bonds that were issued 10 years earlier, which are maturing. And there doesn't seem to be any plan in redeeming these bonds, apart from already the increased cost on the debt that we have. So the situation, it is a lot more gravier than what has perhaps been painted out. And I am shocked, to say the least, that the Presidential Fiscal Commission itself has not yet come to terms with a very calamitous situation that we are sitting with right now. So the long and short of it is this. With the increased amount of money we now need to raise from 240 billion, and Treasury are the only people that must now tell us, immediately following the downgrade, what is the additional hardship, what is the additional pain we have to bear in terms of the interest costs on our debt? Is it 30 billion? Is it 50 billion additional to the 240 billion? But the question is, who are the lenders that are going to agree to buy government bonds of 240 billion? And if they do agree, we need to know who their names are. But more importantly, what are the covenants? What are they demanding that this government must then give in return for that money? But the tragedy is, if we had raised 240 billion rand, but if that 240 billion rand had not gone towards servicing the interest cost on the debt we have, our economy would have grown by 5.85%. And a 5.85% GDP growth would have meant that we would have been having a real chance of dealing with unemployment in this country that is continuing. But because all the money that is being raised by Treasury is going towards servicing debt, it's already putting us in much more deeper state of abyss than perhaps can have been imagined. And this is really what causes me sleep at night. Because if we could have a chance of our economy to grow by 5.85%, we should have done it. What should be done, therefore? What is the solution? For a long time, I have advocated, and there hasn't been anybody who has ever proved me wrong, because this is the only solution that is available to South Africa on this 2.5 trillion rand debt, which equates to 60% of our total GDP is in debt. the only solution is refinancing on a longer tenure and not from the traditional lenders who rely on credit rating agencies' reports. But we need to look at a new breed of lenders who we can still continue to pay them a premium in terms of the yield, but we have to refinance our debt. If we do not refinance our debt, it's not just going to be education or free education that's going to be more remote. Soon we will not even be able to meet the social grants. That's how serious the situation is.
Well, thank you. I think you did let your point come across there. That's Tsepo Khadima, political analyst, joining us in studio, and just saying that he doesn't think the presidency has actually fully understand how much a debt that South Africa is in, and especially after the recent downgrades that we have, we can expect that debt to increase.